Hello and welcome to the Bridging Borders Project. I'm your host, Henna Hundal, and today we're honored to be continuing our interview series with the leaders of Oceania. Today we'll be featuring His Excellency, President Lionel Aingimea of Nauru.
I'm Henna's co-host, Rajagopal, and today we'll be discussing Nauru, a small Pacific island nation that in the 20th century primarily was reliant on phosphate exports. Now, Nauru sustains its economy through a combination of fishing and defense agreements with its regional partner, Australia.
Please join us now in welcoming to the program His Excellency, President Lionel Aingimea. First of all, Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us. And we wanted to begin by talking about the COVID situation. So fortunately, Nauru has not been hit by cases of COVID-19. However, the global economic fallout as a result of this pandemic has been concerning. So could you begin by painting a picture of how Nauru has been affected by the economic impacts of the coronavirus?
Yes, well, I can talk about Nauru in regards to the regional countries here in the Pacific. As you probably are aware, the regional countries here in the Pacific, especially places like Fiji and the Cook Islands and places like that, are heavily dependent on tourism. And therefore, the closure of borders of people leaving their own countries and coming, and closure of countries here in the Pacific because of COVID-19 has affected the economies of those countries. But Nauru in itself is not reliant on a tourist economy. Our economy basically hinges on three things. One is the work that we do with the government of Australia to stop people smuggling. Two is the work we do with fisheries and how we outsource our license to our EEZ, our fishing waters, to countries, basically distant water fishing nations. And the other thing that we also do in regards to this is, of course, our phosphate exports, which has been the primary industry that Nauru has been with for a long, long time. And that's really has enabled us to keep, as a country, our economy running. And so on those three things, as you can notice, can tell that there are things that we rely upon, and we're not really too much reliant on the tourism and the other what happens in the other parts of the region because of their reliance on foreign currency coming in. Our foreign currency that comes in, of course, is from the work that we do with exporting phosphate, with fisheries, and of course with the work that we do with Australia in regards to halting and stopping people smuggling. Now, also in regards to that, we do have short-term and long-term goals that we have to work towards regarding our economy. The short-term goals, of course, and I have to take my hat off and say a big thank you also to the countries that have assisted us in battling COVID-19 before I go to our short-term goals. And this is, of course, Australia. Australia has given us a fair bit of money. Australia, so has New Zealand, so has Japan, and so has the Asian Development Bank. All of these have kicked in and helped us, and we've been able to use the assistance they've given us in various economic situations. For example, to bring in the extra medication that we need to battle COVID-19. We've done that. To sponsor aircrafts coming in, such as Nauru Airlines, to make sure that supplies keep coming into Nauru. We've done that. And also the United States has also given us a lot of assistance in regards to not money itself, but to COVID-19, like I think it was breathing apparatus and things like that. And also, of course, one of our strongest aid and political allies is Taiwan, which has always been helping us in this area. And they have assisted us also quite tremendously. And all the assistance that those countries have given and ADB has given us, of course, held us in good stead in fighting COVID-19. Also, one of the things that we've been looking forward to and we're trying really to battle is, of course, you guys know about this, that ADB and the International Monetary Fund, excuse me, I'll just look at my notes here, the International Monetary Fund, they have they do different scenarios in how they rate countries looking at their GDP, and unfortunately they rate Nauru differently than most other countries. But that is not the reality. The reality is they should, because there are certain things that is not true to Nauru, especially with the work that we do with Australia in regards to people smuggling. That changes a lot, and that depends on the dynamics and the landscape. I should say the seascape of what happens in that area. And so how they see Nauru and how they look at Nauru and how they give assistance to Nauru is based, of course, on our GDP. But that is, like I said, that I would have to say is a fluid area. It changes because of the dynamics of how people smuggling changes within the region. But therefore, getting assistance from them sometimes can be very, very tough, because it is, I suppose, we've got a hurdle that we've got to jump over. That is their definition of what they consider a least developed country, a developed country, a small island state, and things like that. But for us here in Nauru, we see things a bit differently, because basically if there is a gap whereas to funding and to assistance comes from, it could become a political issue, because you could have other bigger countries, more robust countries that have a different agenda to the Pacific coming in and filling in that gap. And so we've had to be really careful in how we've looked at things that's happening in China and with recent developments here in the Pacific in regards to China and Taiwan, and also the United States, and of course Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and India for that matter, and how they're looking here in the Pacific. Therefore, if a COVID situation 19 happens and the economy is starting to be affected, I think it's a very good idea for the international monetary institution, especially like ADB or International Monetary Fund, to really look, how can we assist regional countries? How can we assist Pacific countries in this area so that undue influences can be stopped in coming in to alter, I suppose, the economies of countries and make them dependent on one particular country? Whereas if a lot more of the international money institutions started looking in and changing their definition of what they consider a developed country, that would assist greatly those countries in not being able to look elsewhere to see what source of funding and assistance they can have, especially considering how big an impact the economy on the economies of the region that COVID-19 has had.
Incredible. Now, I wanted to delve in a little bit more about the links between your country and Australia's. So with Australia's recent border closures, how has that affected your relationship with the country, especially in terms of issues of combating piracy and the close economic links that you share between your two countries?
Well, our relationship with Australia has always been very, very close. And as a matter of fact, I would consider Australia family instead of just being like a neighbor or something like that, and being part of the Pacific family and therefore tied together with close custom and cultural ties. I mean, take for example, I'm giving a bit of foundation here first. Take for example, one of our national sports is Australian rules football. And so you can see that kind of exchange of culture and exchange of sporting experts, especially from Australia, coming to Nauru, is a very good thing. But in regards to the assistance they've given us, it's been great. It's been strong. It's been consistent. There is a scripture in the Bible that says, one stands shoulder to shoulder with each other. And that is what Australia has been doing with us. They've stood shoulder to shoulder with us. I do know that closing of the borders is a necessary thing for them, because like most big developed countries, they have a lot more on their plate than I suppose we, the smaller countries, and they're a lot more diverse in regards to what their economy needs for it to keep going. And with the closure of their borders, it doesn't mean they've closed their borders to Nauru. We still have flights coming in and out of Australia to Nauru, out of Brisbane in Queensland. That happens. We have every 2 weeks, we have a passenger flight, and we have freighter flights coming in on a regular basis, I think for every 3 or 4 days. Now, of course, all of those may have been reduced greatly because of COVID and because of the border closures, but it doesn't mean we've stopped altogether interacting with Australia using our planes and things like that. Also, we do have a lot of our imports and stuff like that comes in from Australia. And that means that our shipping lines have had to regularly go forth between Australia, of course, and Fiji and Nauru to make sure that we're not left starving, so to speak, and that we have a regular supply of goods that are coming in, not just food-wise, but other things like building materials and other stuff that's needed for the infrastructure here in Nauru. So overall, even though there are border closures, we still keep a close link. Our borders are semi-open, and we're still travelling in and out of Australia. I understand that the Australian system of travelling in and out of Australia is not governed federally. It is a state issue, and therefore for us to travel into Queensland, that is a Queensland issue. If we need to travel down to New South Wales, that'll be a New South Wales issue, even though our relationship is with the federal government. We've had to, in the past few weeks, forge relationships with the Queensland state government just because of what COVID is doing.
Wonderful. So, Mr. President, you mentioned that Australia is like family and that even through the duration of the pandemic, the borders with Australia have been semi-open. Now with the COVID-19 vaccine being deployed, what is your plan for relaxing those travel restrictions completely?
Well, one of the things, relaxing travel restrictions is really a bilateral thing because of what COVID is doing and how it's flaring up in its different various forms, and it's mutating, and therefore I think the way forward is for bilateral agreements to start kicking into place instead of fifth party rights, which has generally been the accepted norm for the last 100 years of travelling. Now, for us in Australia, this will be interesting. Where do we go from here? If we start opening borders, does Nauru and the Queensland state need to have their own bilateral agreement? Or is it Nauru and Australia itself federally that needs to have a bilateral agreement? So those are the questions that one needs to answer, because each state in Australia has its own different policies and laws in regards to how they regulate who flies in. For example, the Northern Territory, top end of Australia as they call it, allows flights to come in from Singapore and other Asian countries, whereas Queensland does not. Also, Fiji, the other main port that we go to, for us to get into Fiji, because it is a regional country, because it's part of the Pacific family, maybe the fifth party rights still apply, but maybe we'd need to start thinking seriously regarding bilateral discussions as the vaccines start coming in. I do know that the vaccine will not reach our shores because we're very closely tied to Australia in this regard to the vaccine. Will not reach our shores probably till about February next year. And that then would also affect how we ourselves get vaccinated and how Australia itself gets vaccinated, how Fiji itself gets vaccinated, how New Zealand itself gets vaccinated, and any other Pacific country. Also, that touches on what happens with our neighbouring countries such as Kiribati, whom we fly to, such as the Marshall Islands, whom we fly to. There's also the other Micronesian countries like the Federated States of Micronesia and Palau that we want to establish a travel bubble. So when the vaccination kicks in, what happens then? Do everyone, I used to remember when I was going to school in Australia back in the 70s and late 70s, you'd carry in your passport your own quarantine card. And so when you get to the border, they will look through your quarantine card. So you've had this shot, you've had this shot, you've had this shot. And so, you're okay, you can enter Australia. Would COVID then be of the same situation that when people travel, they need to carry their own medical history with them as part of their travel document? Will that now be a requirement under law? And I think it should be something that when bilateral agreements start kicking into place, that would need to be part of a bilateral agreement, because there's no surer way of knowing that your country is kept safe and the person who comes in is also safe. We're fighting an enemy that really we can't see. We're fighting an enemy that could be well within your borders before you realize it's already taking people down. And so there needs to be a defense mechanism and one of those in place. And one of those defense mechanisms, of course, is making sure that people who enter your country, whether you relax the rules or not, are safe to enter. And when you're going into another country, you do not pose yourself as a threat to the safety and the well-being of those in the country that you're going to.
So before I jump into the next question, I actually want to ask a follow-up to the past one. So are you currently in talks to purchase the vaccine from Australia at a discounted price? And how do you plan to deal with cold storage issues, given that the vaccines tend to have to be stored in very cold temperatures?
Already, we have been in agreement with Australia roughly about 3-4 months ago. We got in line to be partners with Australia when they start getting the vaccine, or we're actually part of the queue that we put ourselves in. Cold storage is not an issue here in Nauru. We've got many cold storage facilities here that we can use to store the vaccine, and of course, it'll be under our task force care because it is a COVID-19 issue. So therefore, in that regard, we've got no problems.
Awesome. And pivoting to the next question, I wanted to ask you, what infant industries in Nauru are you actually protecting during this time, either with pandemic aid, given that imports, I'm assuming, have been reduced in the past couple of months?
Yes, some of the primary industries that we're trying to basically look after here is, one is, of course, our fisheries industry. Now, there is a big issue with our fisheries industry if we start, because at the moment, we're trying to fix up our port. The work on that has temporarily stopped because we can't bring in the labourers who are to work on the port to make sure that it meets modern day standards. But the other thing that we do is when there is an emergency on a fishing vessel, that we allow that person to come on island, treat them for the emergency, and then medevac them out whenever they need to go. Now, that's one industry we need to protect. The other industry is basically our phosphate industry. But for that, what we do is when a phosphate ship comes in to load phosphate, our health people go on board the ship and swab everybody on board. And then they're not allowed to come off the ship until we put them through a PCR test and that comes back. Even if it comes back negative, they still have to remain on board the ship. They can't interact. And of course, all our people who interact with the ship are in complete PPE gear. Now, so those are the two primary industries we have here that we have to make sure that we look after. But at the same time, we've got to be smart enough to be able to make sure that the phosphate industry continues. And if there is an emergency touching on a fishing crew member, that we still allow that crew member to come receive the medical assistance that they need to receive and then medevac them out when necessary.
Wonderful.
Basically, those are the two primary industries that we make. There's other things that we are going to do. There is a policy we put in place called the Desperate Imagination Vision, and it basically means thinking outside the box. And it's a policy now by government that anything that you could think of that could start diversifying our economy is worthy to be looked at and to study and to see how we can go forward with it if it's deemed viable. Of course, that whole desperate imagination was pre-COVID. Now, any desperate imagination vision or plan or idea that kicks in now is tempered with COVID. How do we work it? Because it's slowed it down. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that what happens if something similar to COVID pops up in the future? What can we do to safeguard this industry, whatever industry that we're going to start is looked after and secured and protected? That gives you a picture where you have to start basically being a prophet, because you've got to look at what possibly other things could happen besides another virus. Could there be another global economic meltdown? You've got to look at all of these things, and then you've got to look at ways and methods in how to protect it. And that's the tougher ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to return, Mr. President, to the discussion about the relationship with Australia. And you talked about how there's very good working relations right now. And we know there has been some history, however, in light of the closing of the detention center. Looking forward to 2021, is there anything you're hoping specifically to improve about Nauru's relationship with Australia?
Well, there's a number of things that we're in discussions with Australia in regards to our 2021 agenda. Of course, that is one big thing is, of course, the climate change issue. That is an issue that Nauru is championing, also Australia is championing. And that is an issue that is not just a Nauru, Australia issue. It is also a regional issue. It is affecting, it'll have a far more reaching, far more devastating effect, I believe, than COVID-19. Because as climate change increases here in the Pacific, and its effects are, it's like grabbing, you're losing land, you're losing food source, it's affecting parts of your economy because you've got to basically change direction, and in areas that you've got to spend money on, you've got to start pulling money out and start looking in that area and concentrating in the area of climate change. Unfortunately, we here in the Pacific are the highest risk group. We're living the disaster already. We have to work with the disaster that we've got now. It's on our doorstep. But at the same time, unfortunately, we're the ones who, the bare minimum in regards to what we put out into the atmosphere. But we're the ones that are suffering most because of it. And that is one of the biggest discussions we're having with Australia. Because apart from the legal and economic ramifications of climate change, what do you do with countries where the EEZ starts shrinking because you start losing land mass? What do you do when that happens? Then you've got less fishing vessels fishing in your waters. So that's one big area that we're in close discussions with here with Australia. Of course, with the assistance that with the help that the partnership that we've got with Australia in regards to people smuggling, that's something that, again, I will use the word, it's fluid. It changes the dynamics and how things change in the Asia-Pacific region in regards to people smuggling. That is something we keep a close watch on. That is also an ongoing discussion with us. And of course, if there's any other infrastructure assistance that Australia can give us, we do talk with them at great lengths with that. And of course, they're always, whenever it's a good infrastructure project, Australia always says, guys, it's worthy of our look. They look at it, and 9 times out of 10, they tick it off, and the project starts off here. And when we get big project starts here, of course, that generates job. It has a multi-force effect on the economy.
I wanted to jump in a little bit more about the climate change issue you brought up. As you've mentioned before, Nauru is facing the brunt of the crisis, even though it did not cause the crisis. Current estimates project that the island may be underwater within the next half century. Do you have any long-term economic proposals or large-scale population transfer proposals that you're considering for the safety of your people?
Roughly at the last Universal Periodic Review for Nauru, we highlighted there are 9 core human rights treaties. One of them, believe it or not, is not the Human Rights Refugee Treaty. We've said this needs to be a core human rights treaty, and the definition of what defines a refugee needs to start changing. Because the effects of war and being ostracized because of a religious belief or some other right that is inherent needs to expand and start looking at things like climate change. Needs to start changing and look at things when you have, take for example, COVID-19. The effects of COVID-19 is as devastating as any world war. It cripples economies, it takes out people's lives, and it's basically a war that you've had to concentrate on and take resources away from other places to look to tackle this issue. So that was one of the first things we raised a few years ago, that the definition of the word refugee needs to change. That is something we'll keep pushing forward, because if the definition of a refugee changes to include climate change, to include what happens to people who are affected with COVID-19, because the effects are just as devastating as any war or any ostracization of a person because of their personal or religious beliefs. If that is accepted internationally, it's a much easier sell than for people to be able to say, okay, let's see if we can migrate to the United States or to Canada, for that matter, which has been one of the champions of human rights issues and refugees in the world. And that is a recognized fact. And congratulations to Canada on that one. And so these are some of the things that one needs to start looking at, because if it's the first hurdle is always a legal hurdle, I believe. If you get people to accept a new legal definition, it becomes accepted not just at the international level, but also at the social level, also at the economic level, and also at the community level. So that's one thing that Nauru has been pushing for the last few years in this regard, and we'll, of course, keep advocating it more strongly now, taking into consideration what's happening with COVID-19 and climate change. The other long-term prospects, of course, is something that we're already in discussions and already are doing with Australia and New Zealand, whereas we have what we call the crass term is called fruit picking, but there is a better diplomatic term, which I think is where we have workers leave Nauru, go to Australia and New Zealand and help with the fruit picking, with the fruit industry there by becoming fruit pickers. Maybe it's starting to morph a bit now, whereas before it used to be on an annual basis. They fly at the beginning of the fruit picking season, like they come back at the end of the fruit picking season. But now what's happening now is they're staying there longer for 2 or 3 years, and how they're looked after is changing, how the visas that are required for that is changing. So you never know, as things morph and as things change, maybe there could be other areas that at the moment are not foreseeable, but will be a reality in the future, and you'll be able to see, let's move in this direction, let's do this. And that of course would depend greatly on how things really start deteriorating in regards to climate change, in regards to COVID-19, in regards to any other international, I suppose, threat that could pop up and affect the Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Mr. President. And in terms of international threats and issues, one final question to close off the interview, because our program has a global reach. Are there any words you would like to impart to the international community about Nauru?
Well, taking into consideration that we've got this issue with COVID-19, I would just want to highlight what we are doing in regards to a successful battle against keeping COVID-19 out of our shores. By the grace of God, we have been blessed by the fact that we do not have COVID-19 on island, and we've been very strong in fighting that. Now, when it was declared a pandemic back in March this year, we had already been keeping close tabs of this virus, because we knew from history how big an effect it could have on us. Our history, we have 2 major incidences in our history that nearly wiped out the population of Nauru. The first one was the Spanish flu, early last century, and the second one was World War II, where we were so reduced as a people that we were told that if we do not reach a number of 1,500, we would cease to exist as a people and as a nation. And so on both occasions, we had to work very hard. And I say that with tongue in cheek. We've had to work very hard to build a population up to make sure that we reach the number of 1,500 so that we can still be recognized as a people and as a nation. Now, that was front and center when we were looking first at the bird flu, and then with the other flus that started going around with, what was it, before COVID-19, there was, what was that again?
H1N1.
Yes, that one. There was also the, what was it again? Yeah, the SARS virus. So we were keeping that and keeping tabs on that. Of course, I wasn't a politician then, I was a bureaucrat. But now when COVID-19 kicked in, front and center in my mind was our history, and knowing that something like the Spanish flu had once devastated Nauru, we made sure we did not repeat that under our watch. And so since December of last year, to tell you the truth, we were hoping that the WHO would declare it a pandemic back then. But we had to wait because it was still an epidemic. As soon as it declared it a pandemic in March, on the same day we declared a state of disaster here in Nauru. Even though it had not yet reached here in Nauru, even though nothing had happened, we declared it a state of disaster because it enabled us to then to focus our resources in keeping our country safe. And one of the first things we did, of course, was implement what we call the capture and containment policy. It is a policy now that is being used by a number of countries around the world. But we implemented that on day one here in Nauru. We still opened our planes still came in. We changed our flights. From having 3 or 4 flights a week, we just basically changed it to once a fortnight. We changed the protocols in how you board a plane. And basically what it is you board a plane on Air Nauru, you fly to Nauru, we're using the plane as the border itself. So when you come off, you're straight into a quarantine van, you're put into a quarantine area. The quarantine area, because we didn't have any place big enough, we started converting our 2 hotels to become quarantine facilities. And I see countries all around the world now doing the same thing, hotels, but we were doing this way back in March. And we kept improving and made sure that we kept the 14 days, but as the science kept coming out, we changed our policies to make sure that we match the science. Now what we do is, before you board Nauru Airlines plane to come to Nauru, you have a 72-hour test beforehand, a PCR test. You get on board, you're given a wellness pack. So even before, and we were doing this many, many months ago, so even within about a month of declaring a state of disaster, we were giving away wellness packs on the airline, which meant you had hand sanitizer. Our hand sanitizer, just a little bit too strong. It was quite more powerful than the ordinary hand sanitizer. We had them specially made. We had face masks for passengers already. We had separation of seats already happening even before everybody started doing this. And within about 6 weeks, we put in a temperature check at the borders that where people would catch on Nauru Airlines plane to come here. We had trained our air crew, so they knew how to take a temperature, all of those kind of things. We got them trained in that area so that when a person got on board, they got the mask on, they got the sanitizers on, everything done, and they were given temperature checks to make sure that, that we're not carrying a fever or anything like that. They get off here in Nauru, they're into a sterilized environment of a van. Everybody's PPE. The people who meet them are all PPE. They're taken off. They're actually under police escort so that no one can approach that van. No one can. It's under police escort straight to a containment area, basically, which is a hotel, which has been cordoned off. So we had to put in extra fencing, 1.5 meters to 2 meters from another fence, that fence is another 2 meters away from the hotel itself. So we made sure that we had a long enough barrier to keep people out. We trained up we hired extra police. We trained up all the police in the area of first aid, in the area of PPE, in all the areas that is necessary to make sure that our containment policy program was working. And also we trained up by new security personnel and empowered them with laws to be able to do things that if somebody breached the containment policy, there would be legal repercussions. Now, as things have progressed, what we've done also now is 72 hours before you board the plane, you get a PCR test. Once you get off here, you're locked up in a room for 1 day. You can't leave your room. You've done another PCR test. That result comes out, and then you're held again for another 5 days. And another swabbing is done, another PCR test is done, and if it's all clear, then you're released to the public. So our containment policy, it used to be 14 days, but as the science has changed and we've been keeping close tabs on the science of COVID-19, you are in quarantine here, self-room isolation for the first 24 until that PCR test comes out. Then you can walk within the quarantine facility. You're held there for 5 days, and then PCR test again, and then let go. So that's one thing I want to get out to the international community in regards to what we're doing with our COVID-19 and the successes we've had. But the great thing is we also, on once a week, it used to be quite regular, but now once a week, now we do it once every fortnight, was you give your country updates, actual what's happening in country, what you're doing in country, and what's happening around the world. That's one thing we have done. And you do it on television, you do it on radio. The other thing we've done is mass texts going out to every single phone on island, highlighting what is necessary, what needs to be done in regards to COVID-19, what you need to do. And we have regular drills. Even though we don't have COVID-19 here, we have regular drills, and about every 2 or 3 weeks we have a drill. What happens if a person with COVID escapes from the quarantine facility? What happens if there is COVID in the hospital? So we have regular drills, and we see all the gaps that we have. It's a great cost, but it's necessary to be done, because you got to make sure you cover all the scenarios, all the possibilities of how COVID can happen on island or how COVID can come on island. And so we've got to make sure that if we're going to be sentinels, if we're going to be watchmen, you have to be a good sentinel. You have to be a good watchman. And you can only be a good sentinel, you can only be a good watchman if you know all the possibilities of how one can basically be attacked, if I can use warfare terms, by COVID-19, and you've got to make sure that you are ready. And so those are the things I just want to highlight and and it's also very important for the public to be on par with what government is doing. We went to communities, we spoke to church leaders, we spoke to community leaders. When COVID-19 happened, we had many nights when the length of sleep was basically reduced to 2 to 3 hours a night, because we were out with the community, we were talking with the community, we were just getting that message out there, using history as an example, making sure that they're informed, making sure that they do know exactly what is happening. And we held nothing back. I mean, people had all kinds of questions. We made sure we answered those questions. And in the end, everybody was willing to work with government. And that's what happened.
I just really want to thank you for sharing that perspective, about the incredible leadership you've had during this crisis. I think, frankly, a lot of other countries can learn from what you've done in terms of building in that sense of transparency with the people and fostering that sense of community, and declaring a national disaster early on. I think that's a very important message to share, and a lot of other countries could take heed from that.